The Cavendish mansion stood on a secluded hilltop outside Edinburgh, its sprawling grounds shadowed by towering oak trees. The estate, a relic of Edward Cavendish's inherited fortune, spoke of grandeur but carried the weight of solitude. Edward, a reclusive figure in his late 50s, had spent years behind these stone walls, tending to his investments and avoiding human connection. His cold blue eyes and meticulously groomed silver hair lent him an air of authority, but his gaze often carried an unreadable melancholy. This morning, a new presence disturbed the stillness of the estate. Eleanor Bennet, a 22-year-old with a delicate frame and sharp, watchful eyes, had arrived to take up the position of housemaid. She stood in the vast marble foyer, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the ornate surroundings. Her hands rested nervously at her sides as she listened to the butler, Mr. Gibbons, outline her duties. "I expect you to conduct yourself with professionalism at all times," Mr. Gibbons said in a clipped tone, his graying mustache twitching as he spoke. "Mr. Cavendish values discretion. You'll rarely see him, and he prefers it that way." Eleanor nodded, clutching the handle of her suitcase. "Yes, sir. I understand." From the shadows of his study, Edward observed her through the cracked door. He had reviewed her application meticulously. Eleanor's references spoke of a commendable work ethic, but Edward trusted no one on mere words. Betrayal had marred his past, leaving him suspicious of even the most innocent. His latest test was already in place. In the corner of his study, a safe sat conspicuously open, revealing glinting gold bars and neatly stacked documents. Hidden cameras captured every angle of the room. The trap was set, and Edward settled into his chair, prepared to watch. Hours later, Eleanor was assigned to clean the study. She opened the heavy door tentatively, her gaze immediately catching the open safe. Her steps faltered and her breath hitched audibly. She placed her cleaning supplies down and stood still for a moment, as though debating something. Her slender fingers curled into fists at her sides. Edward, watching from a monitor in another room, leaned forward in his chair. His pulse quickened as Eleanor took a cautious step toward the safe. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. "What are you thinking, Eleanor?" Edward thought, his lips tightening, but her next move left him startled. Instead of approaching the safe, Eleanor pulled a feather duster from her supplies and began meticulously cleaning the room. She avoided even glancing at the exposed treasure again, her focus entirely on her task. Edward watched as she reached a nearby shelf, dusting framed photographs of his late parents and an old family crest. She paused at one photograph, a small, faded portrait of a young boy clutching a dog, the child's serious expression mirroring Edward's own features. Eleanor's face softened, and for the first time, a faint, wistful smile broke through her otherwise composed demeanor. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. There was something about her, the way she moved, her restraint, her fleeting smile, that felt unsettlingly familiar. For the first time in years, his calculated plan had yielded not clarity, but confusion. In the quiet of the study, Eleanor picked up her supplies and exited, leaving the safe untouched and Edward Cavendish with more questions than answers. The train rattled through the outskirts of Manchester, its wheels grinding against the iron tracks as Eleanor Bennet sat near the window, clutching a worn book to her chest. Her reflection in the glass mirrored the weary resolve etched on her face. This had been her life, a constant journey between necessity and sacrifice, a rhythm dictated not by dreams but by survival. Eleanor had grown up in the shadow of Manchester's towering mills, where the air always carried a faint smell of grease and smoke. Her mother, Margaret, was a seamstress who toiled endlessly, often late into the night, sewing garments for factory workers. Eleanor and her younger brother, Oliver, grew up on the threadbare edges of life, their childhood defined by hand-me-downs and frugality. Margaret was a woman of quiet strength. "Hard work never breaks a person," she would say, her hands deftly stitching as she glanced at her children. "But losing your integrity will..." Eleanor, even as a child, understood the weight of those words. Her mother's values were as unyielding as the Manchester winds that battered their small apartment on winter nights. When Eleanor turned 17, Margaret's health began to falter. What started as a persistent cough soon turned into something more sinister: tuberculosis. By the time they sought medical help, it was too late. Eleanor took charge, dropping out of school to work as a waitress during the day and a cleaner in the evenings. Every penny she earned went toward medicine for Margaret and food for Oliver. The night Margaret passed away, Eleanor sat by her bedside, holding her mother's frail hand. Margaret's final words were a whispered plea: "Take care of Oliver, promise me." Eleanor had nodded, her tears mingling with the damp air of their small, cold room. Now, at 22, Eleanor carried the weight of that promise like an invisible burden. Oliver, barely 16, was her sole priority. He had recently started an apprenticeship at a mechanic's shop, but his earnings were meager, and Eleanor often found herself sending whatever she could spare to ensure he ate properly. Edward Cavendish, meanwhile, sat in his grand study, staring blankly at the empty glass in his hand. The memories of betrayal still burned as sharply as they had a decade ago. He had built his empire on calculated risks and ruthless ambition, amassing wealth and power. But those closest to him had often seen his fortune as a prize rather than a responsibility. It was his late wife, Marianne, who had inflicted the deepest wound. Their marriage had been a union of mutual respect, but Edward had discovered, through whispers and missteps, that she had been siphoning money from his accounts. The betrayal, compounded by the revelation that Marianne had planned to leave him for another man, shattered Edward's belief in trust. Her death in a car accident, mere days after Edward confronted her, left him with a mixture of grief and relief he could never quite reconcile. Since then, he had distanced himself from others, viewing each new face with suspicion. The arrival of Eleanor in his household unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. As he reviewed the footage from the study earlier that morning, he found himself pausing on the moment Eleanor lingered near the photograph of his childhood. Her expression, so fleetingly tender, hinted at something he couldn't place, but Edward's instincts told him there was more to this young woman than her resume revealed. The open safe had been a deliberate test, one designed to uncover greed or dishonesty. Eleanor's refusal to even glance at the contents had surprised him. Was it discipline, or was there something deeper at play? In her modest quarters that evening, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, a small, frayed letter in her hands. It was from Oliver, who had written to thank her for the small sum she had sent last month. His handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, but his words radiated gratitude. "I fixed my first engine today," Oliver wrote. "The foreman says I've got a knack for it. You don't have to send money anymore. I'll manage. Just take care of yourself, Ellie." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it under her pillow. The ache of longing for her brother was a constant in her life, but she consoled herself with the knowledge that he was safe. For now. In another part of the mansion, Edward poured himself a glass of scotch, his mind flitting between the footage and the memory of his own troubled youth. He, too, had once been a young boy burdened by the expectations of an unforgiving world. His father's harsh discipline and the suffocating legacy of the Cavendish name had shaped him into the man he was today, calculating, solitary, and wary. What Edward didn't know yet was how closely his path would intertwine with Eleanor's, nor how the burdens of their pasts would collide in ways neither could foresee. For now, each remained ensnared by their own struggles, their lives orbiting in silent parallel. The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner faded as Eleanor stood in the doorway of Edward Cavendish's study, her cleaning supplies balanced precariously in her hands. The room, dimly lit by the grey afternoon light streaming through the heavy velvet curtains, held an air of authority and secrecy. Its vast shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, and the scent of aged paper mixed with the faint musk of wood polish filled the space. Eleanor hesitated before stepping inside. Her work so far had been uneventful, dusting ornate furniture, scrubbing immaculate floors, but the study felt different. It was the center of the mansion's gravity, a place charged with the invisible weight of its owner's presence. As she moved further into the room, her eyes were drawn immediately to the open safe against the far wall. It sat unguarded, its door wide, and revealing the gold bars and neatly stacked envelopes within. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. What could this mean? Had someone forgotten to close it? Or was it a deliberate test? The questions swirled in her mind as she placed her supplies on a nearby desk. Her gaze flicked to the corners of the room, a fleeting sense of unease creeping over her. She had always felt like she was being watched in this house, though she dismissed the thought as paranoia. Her heart pounded as she stood still, torn between curiosity and propriety. The temptation was undeniable, a peek into the life of the reclusive and enigmatic man she worked for. Yet her upbringing, her mother's stern lessons about honesty and respect, held her back. After a long moment, Eleanor turned away from the safe and busied herself with the shelves. Her hands trembled slightly as she dusted the edges of the books, her mind racing. She was acutely aware of how easily a single misstep could shatter her fragile security here. Her brother depended on her. There was no room for error. On the other side of the mansion, Edward Cavendish sat in a darkened room before a monitor, his fingers steepled under his chin. The grainy feed from the hidden cameras installed in the study flickered before him, capturing every movement. He leaned closer, his piercing eyes fixed on Eleanor's hesitant figure. When she approached the safe, his breath quickened. He had expected to see her falter, to confirm the cynicism that had become his default view of others, but instead her reaction puzzled him. Her hesitation, the way she stepped back as though burned, and her quick shift to cleaning felt sincere. Then came the unexpected moment. Eleanor reached for a small photograph on the desk, a faded image of a young Edward with his dog, the edges worn from years of handling. She held it gently, her expression softening, as though the image resonated with her in some personal way. Edward's jaw tightened. Her reaction was not what he had anticipated. Suspicion mingled with curiosity, and for the first time in years, he felt the uncomfortable stirrings of doubt about his own assumptions. Back in the study, Eleanor's task continued. She worked with the precision of someone who knew that any imperfection could be an excuse for dismissal, yet her focus wavered as she moved closer to the open safe once more. It was impossible to ignore. The gleam of gold under the muted light, the air of danger it represented, it drew her like a magnet. Her hands tightened on the feather duster. She looked toward the door, then back at the safe. A single step forward brought her close enough to feel its cool, metallic edge. She raised her hand, as though to touch it, but stopped herself. Instead, her gaze fell on an item near the back of the safe, a small trinket box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. She tilted her head, something about its design stirring a vague memory, though she couldn't place it. The urge to open it was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to step back. "I don't belong here," she whispered, as if to herself, before gathering her supplies and leaving the room. Her retreating figure was caught clearly on Edward's screen, her words unheard, but her demeanor unmistakable. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. He replayed the footage several times, scrutinizing every detail. Why hadn't she touched anything? Why had she seemed so moved by the photograph? And what had stopped her from taking even a cursory look at the contents of the safe? The study, once again empty, returned to its silent stillness. The heavy curtains muted the light further as the clouds thickened outside. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in this silent chess game between employer and employee. In the corridor, Eleanor walked swiftly back to the maid's quarters, her mind clouded by a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She hadn't failed her mother's teachings, but the encounter with the safe had left her unsettled. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested, though for what, she couldn't say. Neither Eleanor nor Edward knew it yet, but the quiet moments in that study would ripple outward, setting in motion events that would unravel secrets long buried and alter the course of both their lives. For now, though, each retreated into their respective silences, unaware of how deeply their fates were beginning to intertwine. Edward Cavendish sat in his study that evening, a fire crackling faintly in the grand hearth. The mansion's oppressive silence stretched around him like an invisible shroud. The safe in the corner of the room, now locked again, seemed to taunt him. The footage of Eleanor Bennet's behavior from earlier replayed in his mind. He had expected greed, or at least curiosity, but her restraint and her fleeting expression of longing left him with questions he couldn't shake. "Curious," he muttered under his breath, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Edward decided it was time to act. He called Mr. Gibbons, the butler, into the study. The elderly man entered with a slight bow, his demeanor as unyielding as the polished wood of the estate. "Yes, Mr. Cavendish." "Send Eleanor Bennet to me," Edward said, his tone firm. "I'd like to ask her a few questions." Gibbons hesitated, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Right away, sir," he replied before retreating into the hall. Eleanor was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Green, the mansion's aging cook, arrange the ingredients for the next day's meals. When Mr. Gibbons entered, she stiffened, sensing the solemnity of his presence. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice even, "Mr. Cavendish requests your presence in his study." Eleanor's heart quickened. She wiped her hands on her apron, exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Green, who offered an encouraging nod, and followed the butler down the long, echoing hallway. The journey felt interminable, the walls adorned with paintings of Cavendish ancestors staring down at her as though weighing her worth. When she entered the study, Edward was seated behind his grand mahogany desk, the fire casting flickering shadows across his sharp features. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit," he instructed. Eleanor did as she was told, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes flicked to the safe, now closed, and then back to Edward's inscrutable expression. The tension in the room was palpable. "I trust you're settling into your duties," Edward began, his voice calm but probing. "Yes, Mr. Cavendish," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her unease. "The work is straightforward, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." Edward leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Earlier today, you were cleaning this room. Did you notice anything unusual?" Eleanor hesitated, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize her position. "I did notice the safe was open, sir," she admitted. "It seemed odd, but I didn't think it was my place to question it." Edward studied her closely, searching for any sign of deceit. "And yet, you didn't approach it. Most people would have, out of curiosity if nothing else." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "I was hired to clean, not to pry, Mr. Cavendish. I respect the boundaries of my position." Edward raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her composure. "Interesting," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You also paused at a photograph on the desk. What drew your attention?" Eleanor's cheeks flushed faintly, caught off guard by his question. "The boy in the picture. He reminded me of someone I used to know." she said softly. "It wasn't intentional. I just paused." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. Her response seemed genuine, yet it only deepened the mystery. He decided to test her further. "You seem to have a strong sense of discretion," Edward remarked, his tone light yet probing. "I've had employees in the past who let their curiosity get the better of them. It didn't end well for them." Eleanor met his gaze, her own steady. "I don't take this job for granted, Mr. Cavendish. My priorities lie elsewhere." "And those priorities are?" he asked, though he already had a suspicion. "My family," she said simply. "I need to support them. That's all that matters to me." Edward sat in silence for a moment, tapping a finger against the polished surface of his desk. He couldn't decide whether to admire her honesty or question her motives. Finally, he nodded. "That will be all for now, Miss Bennet," he said, his tone dismissive. "You may go." Eleanor stood, relieved but wary. "Thank you, sir," she said before leaving the room. As the door closed behind her, Edward swiveled his chair to face the fire. Something about her demeanor unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made him question his own cynicism. People were rarely what they seemed, and yet Eleanor's sincerity seemed unshakable. In her quarters, Eleanor sat on her narrow bed, her hands still trembling. She replayed the conversation in her mind, wondering if she had said too much or too little. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Oliver's letters were tucked beneath her pillow, a constant reminder of why she endured the mansion's strange atmosphere. As the mansion settled into its usual silence, two minds remained restless. Edward, contemplating the enigma of Eleanor Bennet, and Eleanor bracing herself for whatever test might come next. Both were unaware that this was only the beginning of a deeper conflict, one that would challenge their beliefs and alter their lives irrevocably. The mansion was cloaked in its usual stillness, the heavy silence broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the distant call of an owl. Edward Cavendish, however, was wide awake. Seated in his dimly lit study, he replayed the footage from earlier that day, studying Eleanor Bennet's every movement. Her restraint intrigued him, but he couldn't ignore the flicker of something else he had noticed, a subtle tension, as though she carried a secret too fragile to expose. As Edward leaned closer to the monitor, his attention was drawn to movement near the rear entrance of the mansion. It was a dark figure, barely discernible in the shadowy footage from the kitchen camera. He frowned and clicked to zoom in, his sharp eyes narrowing. The figure resolved into that of a young man, disheveled and thin, his clothes ill-fitting and his face pale. He moved with caution, slipping inside through the unlocked back door. Edward's first thought was to alert the staff, but he hesitated, curious about the man's intentions. He switched to another camera, following the intruder's path as he made his way toward the servants' quarters. The footage grew more compelling as the man reached Eleanor's door. He tapped lightly, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to be caught. A moment later, Eleanor appeared, her face pale but calm. Edward leaned forward, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. Their interaction was muted by the absence of sound, but their body language spoke volumes. Eleanor gestured quickly, her hands moving with urgency as she handed the man a small envelope. He took it, hesitated, and then reached for her arm as though pleading. She shook her head and gently but firmly guided him back toward the door. Moments later, the man slipped out of the mansion as quietly as he had entered. Edward's jaw tightened as he replayed the scene. Who was this man, and what connection did he have to Eleanor? The envelope she had handed over, its contents gnawed at Edward's thoughts. Money, documents. He felt a sharp pang of betrayal. The trust he had tentatively extended to Eleanor now felt misplaced. Yet beneath his suspicion, a deeper question emerged. What kind of desperation could drive her to risk everything? Unable to ignore the need for answers, Edward summoned Gibbons, who appeared with his usual air of quiet efficiency. "Gibbons," Edward began, his voice low and controlled, "do we have any unaccounted visitors tonight?" Gibbons tilted his head, surprised by the question. "None that I'm aware of, sir," he replied. "Shall I investigate?" "No," Edward said sharply, waving him off. "That will be all for now." Gibbons hesitated before leaving, his curiosity clearly piqued. Edward returned his attention to the footage, his mind racing with possibilities. Eleanor had shown integrity earlier, but this incident painted a far more complex picture. He felt a growing urge to confront her, to demand an explanation, but he knew that timing was everything. Meanwhile, in the quiet confines of her room, Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her head in her hands. Her thoughts churned as she replayed the encounter with the young man, Oliver, her brother. His sudden appearance had startled her, his face gaunt with worry and his voice trembling as he explained his predicament. "I didn't know where else to go," he had whispered, clutching her hands tightly. "They're after me, Ellie. I just need a little help, just this once." Eleanor's heart had ached at the sight of him, the younger brother she had promised to protect, now so desperate and afraid, but she also knew the risk he had taken by coming here. The mansion was no place for secrets, and Oliver's presence could cost her everything. She had handed him the last of her savings, the small sum she had been setting aside for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was all she could offer. Now, sitting alone in the dimly lit room, Eleanor felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't keep this from Edward for long. His sharp eyes and calculated demeanor left little room for error. But what choice did she have? Oliver needed her, and family always came first. Unbeknownst to her, Edward had already made his decision. He would let the events of the night unfold naturally, watching carefully for any further signs of duplicity. For all his wealth and power, Edward knew that trust was the rarest commodity, and he intended to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried it might be. As the mansion settled into uneasy slumber, the threads of suspicion, loyalty, and desperation wove tighter around its inhabitants. Neither Edward nor Eleanor could predict the storm that was brewing, one that would test their convictions and force them to confront the shadows of their pasts. For now, all they could do was wait, each wrestling with their own version of the truth. The early morning light filtered through the thick curtains of Edward Cavendish's study, casting long, pale streaks across the ornate rug. Edward sat at his desk, his fingers steepled under his chin as he replayed the events of the previous night. The image of the disheveled young man slipping into the mansion burned in his mind, along with the quiet urgency in Eleanor's demeanor as she ushered him out. He had planned to confront her immediately, but his instinct for strategy urged him to wait. There was more to uncover, and he intended to do so methodically. Trust, as Edward knew too well, was a fragile commodity. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock on the door. Mr. Gibbons entered, his expression neutral but his posture rigid with concern. "You asked to see me, sir?" the butler inquired. Edward nodded curtly. "I need you to arrange for a private investigator," he said, his tone brisk. "Someone discreet. I want them to look into Eleanor Bennett's background and, more importantly, any connections she might have to individuals outside this estate." Gibbons hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course, sir. I'll see to it immediately." As the butler left, Edward turned his gaze to the window, his mind churning with possibilities. Eleanor had shown remarkable composure in her responses to his subtle interrogations, but the appearance of the young man had shifted the narrative. Who was he, and what had Eleanor given him in that envelope? Eleanor, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, her movements deliberate as she polished the silverware. She could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. The staff had noticed something was amiss, though no one dared voice their suspicions. Mrs. Green, the elderly cook who had worked in the mansion for over 3 decades, was the only one who broke the silence. "Eleanor, love," Mrs. Green said gently, her hands busy kneading dough. "You seem troubled. Is there something weighing on you?" Eleanor hesitated, her grip tightening on the silver fork in her hand. She had always been careful to keep her personal life separate from her work, but the warmth in Mrs. Green's voice disarmed her. "It's nothing, Mrs. Green," she replied with a small, forced smile. "Just a bit of homesickness, I suppose." Mrs. Green's perceptive eyes narrowed slightly. "You're a good girl, Eleanor," she said after a pause. "But don't carry burdens alone. This house, it has a way of suffocating secrets." The words lingered in Eleanor's mind as she continued her work. The truth of them was undeniable. The mansion, with its vast rooms and shadowed corners, seemed to amplify every doubt, every worry. She knew Edward was watching her, his cold eyes always assessing. The question was, how much did he already know? By midday, Edward received a call from the investigator he had hired. The man's voice was clipped and professional as he outlined his initial findings. "Miss Bennet's history checks out, Mr. Cavendish," the investigator began. "She grew up in Manchester, raised by a single mother who passed away a few years ago. She has a younger brother, Oliver Bennett, currently apprenticing at a mechanic's shop. No criminal record, no glaring red flags." Edward's lips thinned. The details were mundane, but he knew there was more beneath the surface. "And the brother," he pressed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's where things get more complicated," the investigator admitted. "Oliver was recently implicated in a petty theft case. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but his name is still on record. It's possible he's fallen in with the wrong crowd." Edward leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Eleanor's unwavering composure, her urgency in handing over the envelope, it all pointed to a deep, unyielding loyalty to her brother. But was that loyalty clouding her judgment? "Keep digging," Edward instructed before hanging up. As the day wore on, Eleanor found herself increasingly uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of footsteps, set her nerves on edge. When she passed Edward in the hallway, his piercing gaze lingered just a moment too long, leaving her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Sitting at the small wooden desk in her quarters, she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write a letter to Oliver. "Dearest Oliver," she began, her handwriting neat but hurried. "I can't stop worrying about you. Coming here was a mistake. It's too dangerous for both of us. Please let me know you're safe. I'll do whatever I can to help you, but you must be careful." As she folded the letter, a soft knock on the door startled her. Quickly slipping the letter into her drawer, she opened the door to find Mrs. Green standing there, her kind eyes filled with concern. "I brought you some tea," Mrs. Green said, holding out a steaming cup. "Thought it might help you sleep." Eleanor accepted the cup with a grateful smile, but as she sipped the tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Secrets, she realized, had a way of unraveling, and in this house, the consequences of their exposure could be devastating. The rain fell steadily over the Cavendish estate, a rhythmic patter that seemed to echo Eleanor Bennet's unease. She stood in the corner of the kitchen, absently drying a plate as the storm outside intensified. The once comforting routine of her work now felt like a fragile veneer, barely hiding the storm that raged within her. Edward Cavendish's presence had grown heavier in the days since the mysterious visit from her brother, Oliver. She could feel his gaze, sharp and probing, following her movements whenever their paths crossed. His questions during meals, though framed as polite conversation, carried an undertone of suspicion that left her breathless with dread. In her solitude, Eleanor clung to the hope that Oliver had found a safe haven. She had begged him to lay low, but the desperation in his eyes when he had come to her left her unconvinced. Her meager savings, slipped to him in an envelope, were all she had been able to offer. The uncertainty of his safety gnawed at her, an ever-present ache that no amount of work could dull. Edward, meanwhile, had received the latest report from his investigator. He sat alone in his study, the firelight casting jagged shadows across his face as he read the damning details. Oliver Bennett, it seemed, had been implicated in an embezzlement scheme at the mechanics shop where he worked. Though the charges hadn't stuck, whispers of his involvement persisted. An accomplice, Edward muttered to himself, his brow furrowing. The connection between Oliver and Eleanor, her secrecy, and the envelope exchange painted a troubling picture. But the evidence wasn't enough. Yet, Edward needed certainty before he acted, and his instinct told him that Eleanor's loyalty to her brother would soon force her hand. That evening, Edward's patience reached its breaking point. At dinner, he broke the unspoken tension with a question aimed squarely at Eleanor. "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "do you have family nearby?" Eleanor stiffened, her hands clenching under the tablecloth. "No, Mr. Cavendish," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "My family is in Manchester." "And do you stay in touch with them?" Edward pressed, his expression unreadable. "Yes," she answered carefully. "I write letters when I can." Edward nodded, leaning back in his chair. His next words were deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "I ask because I've noticed certain disturbances in the house. Unfamiliar faces, late-night movements. I trust you would inform me if you were aware of anything unusual." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Of course, sir. I've seen nothing out of the ordinary." Her calm demeanor only deepened Edward's suspicions. He decided to let the silence linger, watching as she resumed eating with measured precision, her composure flawless. But her grip on her fork betrayed her, a subtle tension that Edward didn't miss. Later that night, Eleanor retreated to her room, her thoughts spiraling. Edward's questions had been too pointed to dismiss as casual curiosity. She sensed that he knew more than he was letting on. The walls of the mansion, with their ornate woodwork and gilded mirrors, seemed to close in around her. Unable to sleep, she pulled out the letter she had started to write to Oliver. Her pen hovered over the page, the words caught in her throat. How could she warn him without revealing too much? What if Edward intercepted her letter? A soft knock at the door startled her, and she quickly stuffed the letter into her drawer. When she opened the door, Mrs. Green stood there, a tray of tea and biscuits in hand. "I thought you might need this," the elderly cook said with a gentle smile. Her voice was soothing, but her eyes were filled with concern. Eleanor accepted the tray, gratitude mingling with the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," she said softly. The older woman lingered in the doorway, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful, Eleanor. This house has a way of magnifying troubles. Whatever's weighing on you, don't let it consume you." Eleanor nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As Mrs. Green disappeared down the hallway, Eleanor sat on her bed, the untouched tea cooling beside her. The cook's words, though meant to comfort, only deepened her resolve. She would protect Oliver at all costs, even if it meant walking the tightrope of Edward's suspicion. Edward, meanwhile, was in his study. staring out the rain-streaked window. His investigator's words rang in his ears. She's protecting him. But to what end? His thoughts turned to his own past, to the betrayals that had left him scarred. He had built his life around the principle that trust was earned, not given. Yet Eleanor's quiet defiance, her unwavering composure, stirred something in him he couldn't name. It wasn't sympathy, but it wasn't indifference either. For now, Edward resolved to tighten his grip on the situation. He would not confront Eleanor directly, not yet. Instead, he would wait for her next move, certain that the truth would eventually surface. The storm outside mirrored the brewing tension within the mansion, its rumble a reminder that secrets, like lightning, always found a way to strike. The rain had subsided by morning, leaving the Cavendish estate draped in a shroud of mist. The distant sound of birdsong mixed with the rustle of leaves as the grounds slowly came to life. Eleanor Bennet stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The tranquility outside felt like a cruel irony against the turmoil within her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor. Moments later, Mrs. Green burst into the kitchen, her usually calm demeanor replaced with a frazzled urgency. "Eleanor, you'd best brace yourself," Mrs. Green said, her voice low. "She's back." "Who's back?" Eleanor asked, setting her cup down, a knot forming in her stomach. Before Mrs. Green could answer, the sharp sound of heels clicking against the tiled floor filled the room. Eleanor turned to see a striking woman in her early 30s enter, her presence commanding the space. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair styled in soft waves and a designer handbag dangling from her arm, she exuded the kind of poise that made everyone around her feel suddenly inadequate. "Charlotte Cavendish," Mrs. Green muttered under her breath, confirming Eleanor's fears. Charlotte's icy blue eyes scanned the room, landing on Eleanor. "Ah, the new help," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I see father still has a penchant for strays." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, but remained composed. "Good morning, Miss Cavendish," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Charlotte smirked, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see if it stays that way," she said, before turning her attention to Mrs. Green. "Where is he?" Mrs. Green hesitated. "Mr. Cavendish is in his study, Miss Charlotte. Shall I announce you?" Charlotte waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Don't bother, I'll announce myself." With that, she swept out of the room, her heels clicking a brisk rhythm as she disappeared down the hall. Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is she always like that?" Eleanor asked softly. Mrs. Green sighed. "Charlotte's always been difficult. She and Mr. Cavendish have their history, and it's not a pleasant one. Best keep your distance." Eleanor nodded, but the encounter left her uneasy. She had seen plenty of people like Charlotte in her life, entitled, ruthless, and ready to tear down anyone who stood in their way. Her presence added a new layer of tension to the already fraught atmosphere of the house. Charlotte strode into her father's study without knocking, her heels sinking into the thick Persian rug. Edward looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Charlotte," he said evenly, leaning back in his chair, "what an unexpected visit." "Is it?" she replied, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow. "I hear things, father. Whispers about strangers sneaking into the house, about you hiring some nobody to prance around as if she belongs here." Edward's gaze hardened. "I see your talent for dramatics hasn't waned." Charlotte ignored the remark, perching on the edge of a chair across from him. "Don't play coy with me! Who is she? This Eleanor Bennet? Why is she here?" "She's a housemaid, Charlotte," Edward said, his tone clipped. "And her presence is none of your concern?" Charlotte's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Everything in this house is my concern, or have you forgotten that this estate is my birthright?" Edward's jaw tightened. "Your birthright is a privilege, not a weapon." Charlotte's expression darkened. "I'm only trying to protect what's mine," she said, her voice low. "You've always been too trusting, Father. And it's cost us before." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Eleanor is under my employ. If you have concerns, keep them to yourself." Charlotte stood, her hands gripping the back of the chair. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she said before storming out of the room. Eleanor felt the weight of Charlotte's scrutiny throughout the day. She caught the woman watching her from across the hall, her gaze sharp and calculating. The tension was palpable, like an electric current running through the air. Even Mrs. Green seemed on edge, her usual chatter reduced to curt instructions. By evening, Charlotte had taken to inspecting the staff's quarters. Eleanor was folding linens when Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her presence like a cold draft. "Eleanor, isn't it?" she said, her voice deceptively casual. "Yes, Miss Cavendish," Eleanor replied, standing straighter. Charlotte stepped into the room, her eyes scanning every detail. "I'm curious, Eleanor. What brings a young woman like you to a place like this?" Eleanor hesitated, sensing a trap. "I needed the work," she said simply. "And yet you seem so comfortable here," Charlotte mused, her tone laced with suspicion. "Almost as if you're hiding something." Eleanor's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "I assure you, Miss Cavendish, I'm here to do my job, nothing more." Charlotte smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that," she said, before turning on her heel and leaving the room. As the door closed, Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. Charlotte's arrival had disrupted the fragile balance she had been clinging to. With Edward's suspicions and Charlotte's probing, the walls seemed to be closing in faster than ever. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Charlotte's presence would prove to be more than a passing inconvenience. It was the spark that would ignite the smoldering tension into a blaze, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. For now, all Eleanor could do was brace herself for the storm ahead. Eleanor sat alone in her room, her hands trembling as she carefully unfolded the letter she had written to Oliver. The ink smudged slightly under her thumb, and she stared at the words, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The shadows of the night seemed to press in closer, the weight of the mansion's cold walls amplifying her unease. Since Charlotte's arrival, the atmosphere had shifted drastically. Eleanor could feel the older woman's presence wherever she went, her sharp gaze slicing through every interaction like a blade. Charlotte's probing questions, her condescending smiles, and her deliberate intrusions into Eleanor's space had left her constantly on edge. It wasn't just suspicion, it was a challenge, a deliberate attempt to unearth something Eleanor wasn't ready to share. She tucked the letter back into her drawer, hiding it beneath a stack of neatly folded clothes. Just as she closed it, her eyes drifted to the corner of the room where a small, inconspicuous object caught her attention, a black button seemingly out of place. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers, realizing with a chill that it didn't belong to her. The conclusion was inescapable. Someone had been in her room. A soft knock startled her, and she turned quickly, her heart pounding. It was Mrs. Green, her kind face peering cautiously through the door. "Are you all right, dear?" the older woman asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. She set down a tray of tea and biscuits on Eleanor's desk, her brows furrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Green, have you noticed anyone unusual around here? I mean, besides Miss Charlotte?" The cook's expression darkened slightly. "Charlotte's enough trouble for all of us," she muttered. "Why? What's happened?" Eleanor held up the button, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think someone was in my room." Mrs. Green's eyes widened. "Do you think it was—" "I don't know," Eleanor interrupted, shaking her head. "But if it was her, I don't know what she might have been looking for." Mrs. Green sighed deeply, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Listen, Eleanor, this house is no place for secrets. Whatever it is you're hiding, it's only a matter of time before it comes to light." Eleanor looked away, her chest tightening. "It's not just my secret," she murmured. "I'm trying to protect someone." Mrs. Green reached for her hand, her grip warm and steady. "You've got a good heart, love, but protecting someone shouldn't mean losing yourself in the process." The words hung in the air long after Mrs. Green left the room. Eleanor stared at the closed door, her mind racing. Could she keep this up? The mounting pressure from Edward, Charlotte's relentless scrutiny, and the ever-present fear for Oliver's safety felt like too much to bear. Elsewhere in the mansion, Charlotte was in Edward's study, her posture as sharp and unyielding as her tone. "Father, you're blind if you can't see it," she said, pacing in front of his desk. "That girl is hiding something. I found this." She held up a scrap of paper, a corner torn from an envelope, its edges faintly smudged with ink. "I don't know what she's planning, but it can't be good." Edward took the paper from her hand, his expression unreadable. "You invaded her privacy?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Charlotte crossed her arms. "I'm protecting our family. Or have you forgotten what happens when you trust the wrong people?" Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "I won't condone your methods, Charlotte. Eleanor's actions will speak for themselves. Until then, I suggest you refrain from meddling," Charlotte scoffed, turning on her heel. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she said as she strode out. As the door closed behind her, Edward sat in silence, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. He had no love for Charlotte's tactics, but her suspicions couldn't be ignored. The torn envelope was a tangible piece of evidence, one that added weight to the questions already plaguing him. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The tension of the day, the growing threats from all sides, left her restless. She got up and paced her small room, the walls seeming to shrink with every step. Finally, unable to contain her frustration, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every creak of the floorboards. She walked toward the study, drawn by a strange compulsion. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was the growing certainty that Edward would discover everything regardless of her efforts. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. Taking a deep breath, she turned it and stepped inside. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the fire. Edward sat in his chair, his silhouette imposing against the flickering light. He turned as she entered, his expression shadowed but unmistakably alert. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what brings you here at this hour?" Eleanor clenched her hands at her sides, struggling to steady her voice. "I need to speak with you, Mr. Cavendish." Edward leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "Then speak." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, the weight of her confession catching in her throat. The room felt smaller, the fire's warmth suffocating. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt truly cornered, the path ahead obscured by shadows she wasn't sure she could face. Eleanor stood frozen in Edward's study, the firelight casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance around her hesitation. Edward watched her intently, his piercing gaze as unrelenting as the weight of the truth she carried. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Mr. Cavendish," she began, her voice shaking but resolute, "there's something I need to tell you." Edward gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said, his tone measured but with an unmistakable undercurrent of curiosity. Eleanor hesitated, every instinct urging her to flee, but she knew that silence was no longer an option. Taking a deep breath, she launched into her explanation. "The young man you saw?" she started, her voice faltering briefly. He's my brother, Oliver. He came to me because he's in trouble." Edward's brow furrowed, his fingers steepling under his chin. "Trouble," he repeated. "What kind of trouble?" She swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "He's been accused of theft and embezzlement," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not true. He's been caught up in something beyond his control, and I was trying to help him." Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "And how exactly were you planning to help him, Miss Bennet?" "By harboring him in my home, under my roof." Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I didn't plan for any of this," she said, her voice firming. "Oliver showed up unannounced, desperate. I couldn't turn him away. He's my brother, and I've promised to protect him." The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Edward's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a storm of thoughts. "Do you realize the position you've put yourself in?" he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "And the position you've put me in?" Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening. "I do, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But Oliver is all I have left. I couldn't let him face this alone." Edward stood abruptly, walking to the window. He stared out into the darkness, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might dismiss her entirely. But when he turned, his expression was unreadable. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his tone softer but no less commanding. "If your brother needed help, why not ask for it?" She looked down at her hands, shame washing over her. "Because I didn't think you'd care," she admitted. "You're guarded, Mr. Cavendish, and I've learned not to rely on others." Edward studied her in silence, his mind racing. He thought of his own youth, of the times he had been too proud to ask for help, too fearful of rejection. Her words struck a chord he hadn't expected, though he kept his emotions carefully hidden. "I should dismiss you," he said at last, his voice heavy with finality. "This is a breach of trust I cannot ignore." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she refused to plead. Instead, she nodded, her hands clenching in her lap. "If that's what you must do," she said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "But I won't tell you where Oliver is. I can't." Edward's gaze sharpened. "You would sacrifice your position here, your livelihood, for your brother." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Because family is all I have." The sincerity in her voice gave Edward pause. He turned back to the fire, his thoughts a tangle of anger, admiration, and something he couldn't quite name. For all her flaws, Eleanor's loyalty was undeniable, and it reminded him of something he had lost long ago. After what felt like an eternity, Edward spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You're lucky, Miss Bennet. I'm not dismissing you, yet, but consider yourself on notice. One more misstep, and you'll leave this house for good." Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Mr. Cavendish," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "I won't let you down." Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he returned to his desk, picking up a pen and tapping it thoughtfully against the wood. When he finally looked at her again, his expression was unreadable. "Go to bed, Miss Bennet," he said. "We'll speak again in the morning." Eleanor stood and left the room, her steps unsteady as she made her way back to her quarters. She felt both relief and dread swirling in her chest. She had been honest, but at what cost? And how much longer could she keep the delicate balance between protecting Oliver and maintaining her position? In the study, Edward remained by the fire long after she was gone. His mind churned with questions, not just about Eleanor, but about his own actions. Her loyalty was rare, perhaps even admirable, but it also carried risks he couldn't ignore. For both of them, the night marked a turning point. The fragile truce that had been established was as tenuous as the flames that flickered in the hearth, beautiful but easily extinguished. The following morning broke with a cold, overcast sky that mirrored the somber tension in the Cavendish estate. Eleanor awoke to the sound of raindrops tapping against her small window, her mind immediately replaying the events of the previous night. Edward Cavendish's ultimatum loomed over her, a reminder of how precarious her situation had become. Despite his restrained anger, she had caught a glimmer of something unexpected in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps even pity, but it was fleeting, and she dared not trust it. As Eleanor dressed for the day, her thoughts turned to Oliver. She had hoped her confession might ease her burden, but instead it felt heavier. She had sacrificed her pride, laid bare her desperation, and yet the threat to her brother's safety remained. If Edward's patience wore thin, if Charlotte discovered too much, or if Oliver made another mistake, everything she had fought to protect could crumble. Downstairs, the tension among the staff was palpable. Charlotte's presence had unsettled everyone, her sharp words and imperious demeanor creating an atmosphere of unease. Even Mrs. Green, typically unflappable, seemed weary as she prepared breakfast in the grand kitchen. "Miss Bennet," the cook said softly as Eleanor entered, "you look like you've hardly slept." "I haven't," Eleanor admitted, her voice low. She glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Mrs. Green, do you think I've made a terrible mistake?" The older woman paused, her kind eyes meeting Eleanor's. "I think you're doing what you believe is right," she said after a moment. "And sometimes that's all we can do." Before Eleanor could respond, the door swung open, and Charlotte strode in, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Her presence filled the room like a storm cloud, drawing every gaze. "Miss Bennet," Charlotte said, her tone laced with icy authority, "my father has requested your presence in the study, immediately." Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to nod. "Of course, Miss Cavendish." As Charlotte swept out of the kitchen, Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with Mrs. Green before following. The walk to the study felt interminable, the weight of the house pressing down on her with every step. When she reached the door, she hesitated briefly before knocking. "Enter!" Edward's voice called from within. Eleanor stepped inside, bracing herself for whatever awaited. Edward was seated behind his desk, his expression as inscrutable as ever. To her surprise, another man was standing beside him, a well-dressed, sharp-eyed figure who exuded an air of quiet authority. "Miss Bennet," Edward began, gesturing for her to sit. "This is Mr. Wallace, a legal advisor I've brought in to investigate your brother's situation." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected this. Edward, of all people, taking action to help Oliver. "Mr. Cavendish, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Don't thank me yet," Edward said curtly. "This isn't a favor, Miss Bennet. It's an investment. If your brother's case has merit, I intend to resolve it, discreetly. But if I discover you've lied to me, there will be consequences." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. Thank you." Mr. Wallace cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Miss Bennet, I'll need as much information as you can provide about your brother's situation, his employer, any associates, details of the accusations. The more I know, the better chance we have of uncovering the truth." Eleanor answered his questions as best she could, though her voice wavered with emotion at times. She described Oliver's apprenticeship at the mechanic shop, the theft allegations, and the shadowy figures she suspected had manipulated him. As she spoke, Edward listened intently, his expression softening slightly, though his silence remained imposing. When she finished, Mr. Wallace nodded thoughtfully. "I'll begin my inquiries today. It may take time, but I'll do everything I can." As he left the room, Eleanor turned back to Edward. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping us?" Edward's gaze was distant, as though he were looking past her, into memories she couldn't see. "Because I've seen what desperation can drive people to," he said quietly. "And because, despite my better judgment, I believe you're telling the truth." Eleanor's chest tightened with gratitude and guilt. She wanted to believe that Edward's actions came from a place of kindness, but she couldn't shake the fear that his patience was finite. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety and cautious hope. Eleanor threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors and polishing furniture with a vigor born of necessity. Charlotte's presence remained an ominous shadow, her sharp eyes always watching, her disdain palpable. By evening, Edward's legal advisor had left the estate, his departure as quiet as his arrival. Eleanor retreated to her room, exhausted but unable to rest. She sat by her window, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds, her thoughts consumed by Oliver. Had she done enough? Could Edward's intervention truly change anything? As the hours dragged on, she finally lay down, though sleep was elusive. The stakes had never felt higher. With every passing moment, the fragile balance she had managed to maintain seemed closer to breaking, and in the back of her mind, one thought loomed. If she failed, it wouldn't just be her life that unraveled, it would be Oliver's, too. The morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting pale rays over the Cavendish estate. Eleanor moved mechanically through her chores, her mind weighed down by the relentless tension. Edward's promise to investigate Oliver's case had been an unexpected reprieve, but it offered little comfort. Every passing hour felt like an eternity, and the mansion's suffocating air seemed to magnify her unease. In the quiet of the kitchen, Eleanor worked alongside Mrs. Green, her movements slow and deliberate. The older woman glanced at her with a mixture of concern and affection. "You'll wear yourself out, love," Mrs. Green said gently, kneading dough with practiced ease. "All that worrying won't do anyone any good." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "I just want this to be over," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I want Oliver to be safe." Before Mrs. Green could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Charlotte entered the room, her presence as imposing as ever. Her cold eyes scanned the scene before she turned her attention to Eleanor. "Miss Bennet," Charlotte began, her tone clipped, "I need you to clean the sitting room immediately, and be thorough. I'm expecting guests." Eleanor nodded quickly, avoiding Charlotte's gaze. "Yes, Miss Cavendish." As Charlotte turned to leave, Mrs. Green muttered under her breath, "A queen without a crown, that one." Eleanor stifled a laugh, but the brief moment of levity faded as she made her way to the sitting room. She worked quietly, her hands steady despite her racing thoughts. The room, with its polished mahogany furniture and heavy drapes, seemed to close in around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor passed through the hallway near the servants' quarters, she was surprised to see Mrs. Green waiting for her. The older woman's expression was serious, a rare departure from her usual warmth. "Come with me," Mrs. Green said, her voice low but urgent. Eleanor followed her to the small pantry tucked away at the back of the kitchen. Once inside, Mrs. Green closed the door and turned to her, her face lined with worry. "Listen carefully, Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard something this morning. Miss Charlotte was speaking to someone on the phone. She's digging into your brother's case." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "What did she say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She didn't mention much," Mrs. Green admitted, "but it was clear she's trying to sabotage whatever Mr. Cavendish is doing to help you. She doesn't want him involved." Eleanor leaned against the pantry wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Why would she do that?" she asked. Though she already knew the answer, Charlotte saw her as a threat, not just to the estate's order, but to her father's attention. Mrs. Green placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, love," she said softly, "and you're not alone in this. If you need help, I'm here." The words brought a lump to Eleanor's throat. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Mrs. Green smiled gently. "You'd manage, but it's always better to have someone in your corner." That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet, Eleanor sat by the window in her room, staring out at the darkened grounds. Mrs. Green's words replayed in her mind, offering a fragile sense of reassurance. She thought about Oliver, about Edward's legal advisor, Mr. Wallace, and the tangled web of suspicion and deceit that had taken hold of her life. A soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Mrs. Green holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This came for you," the cook said, handing it over. "No return address." Eleanor's heart raced as she unwrapped the package, revealing a small envelope and a faded photograph. The envelope contained a brief note, written in Oliver's familiar scrawl. "I'm safe for now, but I can't stay in one place too long. Trust no one but yourself." Oh. The photograph was of the two of them as children, sitting on the stoop of their old apartment in Manchester. Eleanor ran her fingers over the worn edges, tears welling in her eyes. It was a reminder of everything she was fighting for, of the bond that had withstood years of hardship. Mrs. Green watched her silently, her expression unreadable. "Whatever happens, Eleanor," she said finally, "remember why you're here, and remember that people like Charlotte, they don't win unless you let them." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to falter. Too much was at stake. As the night deepened, Eleanor tucked the photograph and note into her drawer, her mind buzzing with thoughts and plans. She wasn't sure how she would navigate the storm that lay ahead, but she knew she wasn't entirely alone. Mrs. Green's quiet strength and unwavering support were a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. In the silence of her room, Eleanor whispered a promise to herself and to Oliver. She would see this through, no matter the cost. And in the flickering candlelight, her resolve seemed almost unbreakable. The day dawned grey and heavy, with clouds that seemed to mirror the tension settling over the Cavendish estate. Eleanor awoke with a start, her thoughts immediately turning to the small package she had received the night before. Oliver's note replayed in her mind like a mantra. "Trust no one but yourself." She tucked the photograph deeper into her drawer, hiding it beneath her neatly folded clothes. The room felt colder than usual, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Downstairs, the atmosphere among the staff was no better. The kitchen buzzed with whispered conversations, the clatter of pots and pans louder than usual to mask the murmurs. Charlotte's presence had upended the house, her sharp eyes missing nothing and her commands growing more imperious by the day. Even Mrs. Green, the steady heart of the household, seemed wearier than usual as she kneaded dough with a furrowed brow. Eleanor entered the kitchen cautiously, her gaze sweeping the room for any sign of Charlotte. The older woman wasn't there, but her shadow loomed large. Mrs. Green glanced up and gave Eleanor a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, love," Mrs. Green said softly. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor shrugged, not trusting herself to speak. Her hands busied themselves with preparing the tea service, a small but familiar task that steadied her nerves. The calm didn't last long. Charlotte stormed into the kitchen moments later, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She carried a stack of papers in one hand and her ever-present air of authority in the other. "Eleanor!" she barked, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Come with me." Eleanor hesitated, glancing nervously at Mrs. Green, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. She followed Charlotte into the sitting room, where the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Charlotte placed the papers on a side table and turned to face Eleanor, her expression cold and calculating. "I've been looking into your brother," Charlotte began, her voice as sharp as the edges of the documents she carried. "And I've found something very interesting." Eleanor's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Cavendish." Charlotte smirked, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't play coy with me. These," she gestured to the papers, "are financial records from the mechanic shop where your brother works, or worked, I should say." "He was dismissed for theft, wasn't he?" Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, her breath coming faster. "Those accusations were false," she said firmly. "Oliver didn't steal anything." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Didn't he?" "Because these records suggest otherwise." She picked up one of the papers, her tone dripping with mock concern. "A trail of missing funds, suspicious transactions. It all points back to him." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She knew Oliver had been implicated, but seeing the evidence laid out so coldly was like a punch to the gut. Still, she refused to back down. "You don't know the full story," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "You don't know what he's been through." Charlotte's smirk widened. "Oh, I know more than you think," she said. "For instance, I know that my father has taken a sudden interest in helping you and your brother. Do you have any idea how foolish that makes him look, risking our family's reputation for, what, loyalty? Sympathy?" Eleanor's chest tightened. "Mr. Cavendish is doing what he believes is right," she said, "and I won't apologize for that." Charlotte stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're nothing more than a liability," she hissed. "And liabilities have no place in this house." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of Edward's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough, Charlotte." Both women turned to see Edward standing in the doorway, his expression dark. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an authority that even Charlotte couldn't ignore. "Father," Charlotte began, her tone shifting to something more measured. I know what you were doing," Edward interrupted, his voice cold, "and it stops now." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Edward turned to Eleanor, his gaze softer but no less commanding. "Miss Bennet, you may go." Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether she was truly free to leave, but Edward's firm nod reassured her. She turned and left the room, her heart pounding as she made her way back to the kitchen. In the sitting room, Edward faced his daughter, his disappointment evident. "You've gone too far, Charlotte." "I'm protecting our family," Charlotte shot back. "Someone has to, since you seem incapable." Edward's expression hardened. "Protecting our family doesn't mean destroying someone else's. Eleanor has shown nothing but integrity. If you continue to undermine her, you'll find yourself answering to me." Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. As Edward left the room, she glared at the stack of papers on the table, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. For Charlotte, the battle was far from over. In the kitchen, Eleanor sat beside Mrs. Green, her hands still trembling. The older woman placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, her voice steady. "You've got more strength than you realize, love," she said. "Don't let her break you." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever Charlotte's next move might be, she knew she had to be ready. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight was just beginning. The grey light of the afternoon dimmed further as a storm gathered on the horizon. The Cavendish estate seemed to hold its breath, the usual rhythm of the household replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. Eleanor felt it acutely. the weight of unspoken accusations and simmering hostilities pressing down on her like the air before a thunderclap. She was dusting the large, gilded mirror in the dining room when the sharp sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. Eleanor froze, her reflection a pale and anxious figure in the polished glass. Moments later, Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with barely concealed triumph. "Miss Bennet," she said crisply, her voice carrying an edge that immediately set Eleanor on guard. "Mr. Cavendish wishes to see you, now." Eleanor's heart raced, but she nodded and set down her cleaning cloth. As she walked past Charlotte, she couldn't help but notice the faint smirk curling at the corners of the woman's lips. It sent a shiver down her spine. She made her way to the study, her steps slow and deliberate. When she entered, Edward was seated behind his desk, his face shadowed by the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. On the desk before him lay a small, leather-bound book and a folded piece of paper. The room smelled faintly of cedar and tension. "Sit," Edward said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Eleanor obeyed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Edward's piercing gaze seemed to strip away every layer of composure she tried to maintain. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice low but steady, "do you know what this is?" He picked up the folded paper and held it up for her to see. She shook her head, though her stomach twisted with unease. "No, sir." Edward unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents before looking back at her. "It's a bank statement, specifically one that shows several suspicious withdrawals made from an account associated with this estate." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "What does that have to do with me?" "That's what I intend to find out," Edward said, leaning forward. "These transactions coincide with the time frame of your employment here. And while I'd like to believe in your integrity, there's something you should see." He opened the leather-bound book, revealing a stack of photographs. He slid one across the desk toward her. Eleanor's heart dropped as she recognized the image. It was a photo of her brother, Oliver, standing outside a small, nondescript building. In his hand was an envelope, one that Eleanor knew she had given him. Her voice failed her as she stared at the picture. Edward's expression darkened, and he slid another photo toward her. This one showing Oliver handing the envelope to a man whose face was obscured. "Explain this," Edward demanded, his voice colder now. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. She wanted to defend herself, to explain the truth, but she didn't know where to begin. "I gave him that envelope," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't stolen money. It was my savings, I swear." Edward's eyes narrowed. "And you expect me to believe that?" "I'm telling the truth," Eleanor pleaded. "Oliver came to me because he was desperate. I was trying to help him, not what?" Edward interrupted sharply. "Not compromise this household, not put us all at risk." Eleanor's breath hitched as the door to the study opened, and Charlotte stepped inside. She moved with calculated grace, her expression one of feigned concern. "Father," Charlotte said smoothly, "I hate to interrupt, but I thought you might need this." She held up another document, which she placed on the desk. "A report from the investigator you hired. It seems Miss Bennet's brother has been less than forthcoming about his activities." Edward picked up the document, his jaw tightening as he read. "Oliver has been implicated in further thefts," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "And you, Miss Bennet, have been harboring him." "That's not true," Eleanor cried, standing abruptly. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Oliver is innocent. He's being framed," Charlotte scoffed, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Oh, Eleanor, you poor thing. Loyalty is admirable, but it can blind us to the truth. Perhaps it's time to accept that your brother isn't who you think he is." Eleanor turned on Charlotte, her frustration boiling over. "You don't know him." she snapped. "And you don't know me." Charlotte's expression hardened. "I know enough to see that you've brought chaos into this house, and I won't stand by while my father is manipulated." "Enough!" Edward said sharply, cutting through the argument. He rose from his chair, his commanding presence silencing them both. "This is not the time for accusations or excuses. Miss Bennet, you will stay in your quarters until I've made my decision about your future here." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but thought better of it. She nodded stiffly, her vision blurred with unshed tears as she left the study. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her as she made her way back to her room, each step heavier than the last. In her quarters, Eleanor sank onto her bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the mattress. She felt the weight of Charlotte's betrayal, the sting of Edward's disappointment, and the crushing realization that the fragile trust she had fought so hard to build was unraveling. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Eleanor allowed herself to cry. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her, the rain pounding against the window as if trying to drown out her despair. The rain had not let up by the next morning, its relentless patter against the windows, a backdrop to the heavy atmosphere in the Cavendish estate. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the floor. The events of the previous day weighed on her like a leaden cloak. The photographs, Charlotte's calculated machinations, and Edward's cold demeanor, all of it replayed endlessly in her mind. She felt trapped, not just by the accusations against her, but by the gnawing fear for Oliver's safety. If she couldn't prove his innocence, he would be lost, and so would she. A soft knock broke her reverie. Eleanor opened the door to find Mrs. Green, holding a tray of tea and a warm expression that offered a glimmer of solace. "I thought you might need this," the cook said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. Eleanor managed a small smile as she accepted the tray. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," she murmured. The older woman sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. "I heard about what happened," she said softly. "That Charlotte, she's a force. I'll give her that. But she doesn't know everything." Eleanor's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Green hesitated, her gaze steady but filled with meaning. "Charlotte's ambition blinds her, and that's her weakness. She wants to control everything, but in her haste, she often misses the finer details." Eleanor looked at the cook, her heart swelling with cautious hope. "Do you think I can fight this?" "You can," Mrs. Green said firmly. "But you'll need to be smart about it, and you'll need help." Eleanor nodded slowly, the beginnings of an idea forming in her mind. She had spent her life relying on herself, but this was a battle she couldn't win alone. "Will you help me?" Mrs. Green's warm hand covered hers. "I wouldn't be here if I wouldn't." Eleanor spent the rest of the day quietly gathering her thoughts. The storm outside mirrored the resolve growing within her. She knew she needed to confront Edward directly, not with pleas or apologies, but with evidence and a plan. If she could shift his focus away from Charlotte's manipulations and back to the truth, she might stand a chance. That evening, as the rest of the household settled into the muted rhythms of the night, Eleanor made her way to the study. The halls were dimly lit, their shadows flickering like restless spirits. She paused outside the heavy oak door, steadying her breath before knocking. "Come in," Edward's voice called. Eleanor pushed the door open, stepping into the familiar space. Edward sat at his desk, a glass of scotch in hand, and his expression unreadable. He looked up as she entered, his gaze cool but curious. "Miss Bennet," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I assume this is important." "It is," Eleanor replied, taking a seat. Her hands rested firmly on her lap, though she could feel them trembling. "I need to speak with you about the accusations against my brother and against me." Edward leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." Eleanor took a deep breath. I know things look bad, but Oliver isn't guilty of what he's been accused of. Someone set him up. And I believe the same people who targeted him are using this situation to manipulate you and this household. Edward's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Encouraged, Eleanor continued, Charlotte's actions yesterday weren't about protecting this family, she said, her voice gaining strength. They were about consolidating control. She doesn't care about the truth. She cares about power. Edward's jaw tightened, though he remained silent. Eleanor pressed on. I have no intention of dragging this household into scandal, she said, but I won't let Oliver be destroyed by lies. If you'll give me the chance, I can prove his innocence, and I can prove that what's happening isn't a coincidence. It's part of something larger. Edward set his glass down with a quiet thud. And how do you propose to do that? He asked, his voice steady but edged with skepticism. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment. I need access to the records Charlotte found, she said, and I need your investigator to look into the connections between the accusations against Oliver and the mechanic's shop where he worked. If we can trace the money... Edward held up a hand, silencing her. He regarded her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he spoke. You're asking me to take a significant risk, he said, one that could backfire on both of us. I know, Eleanor said quietly, but if I fail, I'll leave this house and accept the consequences. All I ask is the chance to prove the truth. Edward studied her, his sharp gaze probing for any sign of deceit. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. You have 3 days, he said. If you can't produce results by then, I'll have no choice but to act on the evidence in front of me. Eleanor's heart surged with both relief and dread. Thank you, Mr. Cavendish, she said, standing. I won't let you down. As she left the study, the weight of the task ahead settled heavily on her shoulders, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. With Mrs. Green's quiet support and Edward's reluctant backing, she had a chance to fight back against the lies and to protect Oliver's future. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain tapering off into a gentle drizzle. It was as though the world itself was offering a small reprieve, a brief moment of calm before the battle that lay ahead. Eleanor clung to that moment, knowing it might be all she had to sustain her in the days to come. The morning broke with a tentative light, pale beams piercing through the lingering storm clouds over the Cavendish estate. Inside the mansion, the tension remained as thick as the damp air outside. Eleanor dressed quickly, her resolve steeling as she prepared for the task ahead. She had 3 days to unravel the web of lies that threatened not only her life, but also her brother's future. In the kitchen, Mrs. Green greeted her with a warm but worried smile. You've got that look in your eyes, the older woman said, handing Eleanor a cup of tea, like a soldier heading to battle. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm mug, the faint aroma of chamomile calming her frayed nerves. That's what it feels like, she admitted. But I can't lose this fight, Mrs. Green. Not for me, not for Oliver. The cook patted her hand reassuringly. You've got more strength than you know, love. Just keep your wits about you. Eleanor's first stop was Edward's study. She needed access to the documents Charlotte had gathered, the financial records that had been used to paint Oliver as a thief. As she stepped inside, Edward was already seated at his desk, the morning light casting sharp shadows across his austere features. I wasn't expecting you so early, he said, looking up from a stack of papers. I need to start immediately, Eleanor replied, her tone steady. May I see the records? If I can find inconsistencies, we might be able to trace the real source of the theft. Edward nodded, pushing the folder across the desk. Be careful with those, he said. They're the only copies we have. Eleanor took the folder and opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. As she studied the transactions, patterns began to emerge, small, regular withdrawals that seemed deliberate but also pointedly designed to implicate someone without direct access to the accounts. "Who else has access to these records?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Edward considered her question before responding. "Charlotte oversees most of the estate's finances, though she delegates some tasks to a third-party accountant." Eleanor's heart sank at the confirmation. Charlotte had positioned herself perfectly to manipulate the situation. "I'll need to see the accountant's reports," she said, her voice firm. "If there's a discrepancy, it might point us in the right direction." Edward picked up the phone on his desk. "I'll call Mr. Wallace and have him retrieve the reports. They should be here by this afternoon." The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor worked in the small office adjacent to the study, combing through pages of financial data. The columns of numbers blurred together at times, but she pressed on, driven by determination and the faint hope that she might uncover the truth. By mid-afternoon, Mr. Wallace arrived with a new stack of documents. He placed them on the desk with a nod of acknowledgement. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone professional but kind. "Mr. Cavendish has instructed me to assist you in any way I can. Let me know if you need clarification on any of these." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, grateful for his support. As she sifted through the accountant's reports, a faint thread of inconsistency began to emerge. The stolen funds, though small, had been funneled through a secondary account, one not tied to Oliver, but to an unknown entity. Her heart quickened as she traced the transactions, each one leading closer to an address in London. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, calling Edward into the room. "Look at this. The funds weren't taken by Oliver. They were redirected here." She pointed to the address on the page. Edward examined the documents closely, his expression darkening. "That's not a personal account," he said. "It's tied to one of our failing ventures, a boutique investment Charlotte insisted on managing." Eleanor felt a spark of vindication. "If we can prove the money was funneled there intentionally, it would exonerate Oliver." Edward's jaw tightened. "I'll call the bank and demand immediate clarification. If Charlotte is involved, we'll have our answer by tonight." As evening fell, the tension in the mansion reached its peak. Edward returned to the office, his face grim but determined. "The bank confirmed the account belongs to a company Charlotte manages," he said. "She claimed the funds were transferred to cover operational losses, but the timing aligns too perfectly with the accusations against your brother." Eleanor felt a rush of relief, tempered by the realization that this was far from over. "What happens now?" she asked. Edward's eyes met hers, a rare flicker of respect in his gaze. "We confront her, together." The confrontation took place in the grand sitting room, its ornate furnishings a stark contrast to the raw emotions crackling in the air. Charlotte stood near the fireplace, her posture as rigid as her expression. "Father," she said coolly, "what's the meaning of this?" Edward stepped forward, holding up the documents. "Explain these transactions," he demanded, his voice cold as steel. Charlotte's composure faltered, but only for a moment. "They were necessary," she said, her tone defensive. "The company was struggling, and You used the estate's funds to cover your failures," Edward interrupted, his voice rising. "And you framed Oliver Bennet to deflect suspicion. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Charlotte's eyes flashed with anger. "I did what I had to do to protect this family," she snapped. "Someone had to. By destroying someone else's," Eleanor cut in, her voice trembling with righteous fury. "You almost ruined my brother's life to save face." Charlotte turned on her, her expression venomous. "You have no idea what it takes to run this estate," she hissed. "You're nothing but a liability." "That's enough," Edward barked, silencing them both. He turned to Charlotte, his disappointment evident. You've gone too far. There will be consequences." Charlotte's face hardened, but she said nothing. As she stormed out of the room, the storm outside broke anew, thunder rumbling ominously in the distance. Eleanor stood beside Edward, her relief tempered by exhaustion. The truth had come to light, but the fight was far from over. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, the weight of vindication settling lightly on her shoulders. The storm outside raged on through the night, a relentless deluge that mirrored the turmoil within the Cavendish estate. Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite the small victory of exposing Charlotte's schemes, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her. Proving Oliver's innocence was no longer just a fight for her family, it had become a battle for her very survival in this house. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Mrs. Green stepped inside, her face lined with worry but her eyes steady. "Mr. Cavendish wants to see you in the study," she said softly. Eleanor's heart sank. She nodded, standing on legs that felt like lead. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," she whispered, brushing past the older woman with a faint attempt at a smile. When Eleanor entered the study, Edward was already there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. The storm cast fleeting shadows across the room, the flicker of lightning illuminating the stern lines of his face. "Sit," he said without turning. Eleanor obeyed, folding her hands tightly in her lap. The silence stretched unbearably until Edward finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the evidence," he began, his voice measured. "It's clear that Charlotte manipulated the estate's finances and attempted to frame your brother." Eleanor exhaled a shaky breath, relief mingling with trepidation. "But," Edward continued, his gaze hardening, "the damage she's caused is extensive. The reputation of this family, the stability of the estate, all of it hangs by a thread. And now, the authorities are involved." Eleanor's eyes widened. "The authorities," she echoed, her voice trembling. Edward nodded grimly. "A formal investigation has been opened into the financial discrepancies, and whether or not Oliver was directly involved, his name is inextricably tied to this mess. If we don't act decisively, he could face serious consequences." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's gaze bore into her, unyielding. "You must testify," he said, "in front of the estate's trustees and the investigators. You'll need to present the evidence we've gathered and make a case for Oliver's innocence. But be warned, Charlotte won't go quietly. She'll use everything in her power to discredit you." Eleanor's breath caught. She had expected a confrontation, but not one so public, so fraught with potential failure. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice breaking. Edward's expression softened, just slightly. "Then I will do what I can to protect your brother," he said. "But your position here will be untenable." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She stood, her hands trembling at her sides. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'll testify." The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was electric with anticipation. Word of the trustees' meeting had spread among the staff, and though no one spoke openly about it, the tension was palpable. Eleanor dressed carefully, her hands fumbling with the buttons of her plain blouse. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not when so much was at stake. Mrs. Green appeared at her door, carrying a small tray with tea and toast. "You've got this, love," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "You're stronger than you think." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "I don't feel strong." The older woman's expression softened. "Strength isn't about not being afraid," she said. "It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are." The trustees' meeting was held in the grand dining hall, its high ceilings and ornate furnishings lending an air of solemnity to the proceedings. Eleanor entered the room to find Edward seated at the head of the long table, flanked by the estate's trustees, stiff, formal men in tailored suits. Charlotte stood near the window, her expression calm, but her eyes gleaming with malice. Eleanor's heart pounded as she took her place at the far end of the table, clutching the stack of documents that represented her brother's only hope. The room felt stifling, the weight of expectation pressing down on her like a physical force. Edward cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs that had filled the room. "We are here to address serious allegations concerning the estate's finances," he began. "Miss Bennet has agreed to testify regarding the evidence we've gathered." Eleanor stood, her legs trembling beneath her as she faced the room. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet the trustees' gazes. Slowly and deliberately, she presented the evidence, outlining the discrepancies in the financial records and the timeline of events that implicated Charlotte. Her voice steadied as she spoke, gaining strength with every word. She explained how the funds had been funneled through the boutique investment account, how the transactions had been deliberately timed to coincide with Oliver's employment at the mechanic shop, and how Charlotte had used her position to orchestrate the entire scheme. When she finished, the room was silent. Eleanor's heart raced as she sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. Charlotte stepped forward, her expression as smooth as ever. "This is preposterous," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Miss Bennet is hardly a reliable witness. She's been protecting her brother, a known thief, since the beginning." Eleanor clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm as Charlotte continued to hurl accusations. But to her surprise, Edward stood. "Enough, Charlotte," he said, his voice firm. "The evidence speaks for itself. This meeting is about the truth, not your attempts to deflect blame." Charlotte's composure faltered for the first time, her face flushing with anger, but she said nothing as Edward turned to the trustees. "I believe we have sufficient evidence to clear Oliver Bennet's name and address the real issues at hand," he said. "I trust you will see that justice is done." The trustees exchanged glances before nodding in agreement. Relief washed over Eleanor, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first step. The battle for redemption was far from over. The storm had long subsided, but its aftermath lingered in the air, heavy and expectant. The Cavendish estate, usually so composed, seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Green. The older woman's comforting presence had been Eleanor's anchor throughout the ordeal, but even her quiet strength couldn't ease the knot of tension in Eleanor's chest. Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall. The meeting with the trustees had ended hours ago, and Edward had since sequestered himself in his study. The silence from him was deafening, each passing moment a reminder that her fate, and Oliver's, hung by the thinnest of threads. The door creaked open, and Gibbons entered, his usual stoic expression replaced with something softer, almost apologetic. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low, "Mr. Cavendish requests your presence in the drawing room." Eleanor felt her stomach lurch. She stood on unsteady legs, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Green, who gave her a reassuring nod. "You've done all you can," the cook whispered. "Now trust in yourself." Eleanor followed Gibbons through the winding halls of the mansion, her steps slow and deliberate. When they reached the drawing room, Gibbons opened the door for her, then stepped aside, his gaze carefully averted. Edward stood near the fireplace, his tall figure silhouetted against the flickering flames. Charlotte was seated on a nearby armchair, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of indifference. The room was oppressively quiet, save for the faint crackle of the fire. "Miss Bennet," Edward began, his voice calm but heavy with an undertone of finality. "Please, have a seat." Eleanor obeyed, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. She felt Charlotte's gaze on her, sharp and unrelenting, but she refused to meet it. Edward cleared his throat, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "The trustees have reviewed the evidence and reached a decision," he said. "They agree that Oliver's involvement in the thefts was orchestrated, and he will not face further accusations." Relief washed over Eleanor like a wave, her shoulders sagging as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in us." Edward raised a hand, stopping her before she could continue. "However," he said, his tone sharpening, "there are consequences. The trustees demand a gesture that will restore their confidence in this estate's leadership. They want accountability and restitution." Eleanor frowned, her relief giving way to confusion. "What do you mean?" Edward's gaze flicked briefly to Charlotte before returning to Eleanor. "To repair the damage Charlotte has done, I will be cutting ties with certain ventures she oversees. Her involvement in this household's finances will end." Charlotte stiffened but said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And you," Edward continued, his voice softening slightly, "will need to leave the estate." Eleanor's heart stopped. "Leave," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why? I didn't—" "This is not about guilt," Edward interrupted, his expression pained. "This is about perception. The trustees see your presence here as a liability. They fear it will attract further scrutiny, despite the truth we've uncovered." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to break. "So I'm being punished," she said quietly, "for protecting my brother." Edward's jaw tightened. "It's not fair," he admitted. "But it's the only way to ensure Oliver's name remains untarnished." The weight of his words sank in, each one a blow to the fragile hope she had clung to. She looked at Charlotte, whose impassive expression betrayed no satisfaction, no triumph, only a cold detachment. "Fine," Eleanor said at last, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I'll leave, but I want your word, Mr. Cavendish, that Oliver will be safe, that he'll have a chance to rebuild his life." Edward nodded solemnly. "You have my word." Eleanor stood, her legs trembling beneath her. "Then I'll go," she said. She turned toward the door, but Edward's voice stopped her. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone softer now, "for what it's worth, I admire your strength, and I hope you find the peace you deserve." She paused, her back to him, before nodding and leaving the room. As the door closed behind her, she felt the full weight of what she had sacrificed. Her position, her safety, her fragile sense of belonging, all of it had been stripped away. But Oliver was safe, and that, she told herself, was all that mattered. Mrs. Green was waiting for her in the kitchen, her expression a mix of sorrow and pride. "You've done a brave thing, Eleanor," she said softly. Eleanor forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "I don't feel brave," she admitted. The older woman placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the bravest acts don't feel like courage in the moment, but they are." As Eleanor packed her few belongings later that night, the storm outside began to build again, the wind howling through the trees. She paused by the window, staring out at the darkened grounds. Despite everything she had lost, there was a quiet strength in her heart, a determination to move forward, no matter how uncertain the path. For now, she would leave. But she would carry with her the knowledge that she had fought for what mattered, that she had protected her brother at all costs, and perhaps one day that knowledge would be enough. Eleanor stood at the entrance of the Cavendish estate, her small bag of belongings at her side. The cool morning air bit at her cheeks, a stark reminder that she was leaving behind not only the shelter of the house, but also the fragile connections she had forged within its walls. Mrs. Green had been there to bid her a quiet goodbye, her tearful hug conveying all the words that didn't need to be said. Eleanor had taken solace in the older woman's support, but the reality of her departure weighed heavily. The gravel crunched underfoot as she made her way to the estate's gates. For the first time in weeks, the mansion seemed eerily still, as if the storm that had raged both inside and outside its walls had finally dissipated. Yet, Eleanor's heart felt anything but calm. As she reached the gate, a voice called out behind her, "Eleanor!" She turned, her breath catching as she saw Oliver jogging toward her. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face lined with worry, but his eyes held a spark of determination. "Oliver," she breathed, her voice breaking. "What are you doing here?" He stopped a few feet from her, catching his breath. "I couldn't let you leave like this," he said, his tone resolute, "not without saying thank you." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "You shouldn't be here," she said, glancing nervously back toward the mansion. "It's too risky." Oliver shook his head, stepping closer. "I had to come," he insisted. "You've sacrificed everything for me, Eleanor. I can't let you carry this alone anymore." His words hit her like a wave, and she felt the tears she had held back for so long begin to spill over. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy you." "And I can't let them destroy you," Oliver replied firmly. "You've always been the strong one, the one who kept us together, but it's my turn now." Eleanor stared at him, her heart aching with both love and fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm going to turn myself in," Oliver said, his voice steady. "I'll tell them everything I know about the mechanic's shop, about the people who set me up. If they want someone to blame, they can blame me. But you," his voice broke slightly, "you deserve a chance to live your life without this weight." Eleanor shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "No, Oliver, you don't understand what you're saying. They'll use you as a scapegoat. They won't care about the truth." "Maybe not," Oliver admitted, "but I won't let your life be ruined because of me. You've done more for me than I could ever repay. Let me do this, Eleanor. Please." Eleanor's tears fell freely now, and she reached out to grasp his hands. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "There has to be another way." Oliver's grip tightened, his gaze unwavering. "There isn't. This is the only way to make things right for both of us." The sound of a car approaching broke the moment, and they both turned to see Edward's black sedan pulling up to the gates. Eleanor's heart sank as she saw him step out, his expression unreadable. "Oliver Bennett," Edward said, his voice even but firm. "I assume you've come to make a statement." Oliver straightened, his shoulders squared. "I have, sir. I'm ready to tell the truth." Edward's gaze flicked to Eleanor, who stood frozen, her hands still clasping Oliver's. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, respect, perhaps, or pity, but his expression remained composed. "Very well," Edward said. "Come with me." "No!" Eleanor cried, stepping in front of Oliver. "He's not going anywhere until you promise me he'll be treated fairly. He's innocent, Mr. Cavendish. You know that." Edward studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'll see to it that the truth is heard," he said. "You have my word." Oliver placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Eleanor," he said softly. "This is the right thing to do." Eleanor stepped aside reluctantly, her heart breaking as she watched Oliver follow Edward back toward the car. Before he got in, he turned to her, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't give up. Not ever." The car pulled away, leaving Eleanor standing at the gates, her tears mixing with the cold morning air. She felt a deep ache in her chest, but beneath it, a spark of hope began to flicker. Oliver's courage had given her something she hadn't felt in a long time, the belief that they could overcome this, no matter how long the road ahead. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light over the estate, Eleanor stood a little taller. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Together, she and Oliver had faced insurmountable odds, and though the battle wasn't over, she knew they had the strength to endure. The next few days passed in a haze for Eleanor, each moment dragging with a mix of dread and hope. The mansion was quieter than it had been in weeks, the storm of accusations and betrayals finally dissipating. Yet, in that silence, Eleanor found herself consumed by the weight, by the uncertainty of Oliver's fate and what Edward Cavendish's promise truly meant. Eleanor spent most of her time in the kitchen, seeking solace in the steady rhythm of helping Mrs. Green prepare meals or clean. The older woman's presence was a balm, her gentle words a reminder that Eleanor wasn't entirely alone. "Anything worth fighting for takes time," Mrs. Green said one morning as she handed Eleanor a basket of vegetables to peel. "You've planted seeds of truth, love. Now you just have to let them grow." Eleanor nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She couldn't shake the image of Oliver climbing into Edward's car, his determined expression etched into her memory. He had faced his fear, risked everything to protect her. The least she could do was hold on to hope. On the third morning after Oliver's departure, a knock at the kitchen door startled Eleanor out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Mr. Wallace standing there, his expression neutral but his eyes carrying a hint of something softer. "Miss Bennet," he said, stepping inside, "Mr. Cavendish has asked me to deliver an update." Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. "Oliver? Is he—" "He's safe," Wallace said quickly, holding up a hand to calm her. "He's been released from questioning. The investigators found enough evidence to corroborate his claims. The individuals responsible for the thefts at the mechanic's shop are now under investigation." Eleanor's knees nearly gave out from relief. She gripped the edge of the counter, her breath coming in short gasps. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me." Wallace nodded. "Your brother showed remarkable courage, Miss Bennet, and I believe your actions played a significant role in securing his freedom." Before Eleanor could respond, another voice came from the doorway. "He's not wrong." She turned to see Edward standing there, his presence as commanding as ever. His expression, however, was softer than she had ever seen it. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, wiping her tears hastily, "I don't know how to thank you." Edward stepped further into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "There's no need for thanks," he said. "What happened to Oliver was an injustice, and it was my responsibility to see it corrected." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Edward hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's something else I wanted to tell you. I've spoken with the trustees, and I've convinced them to reconsider their position on your departure. If you wish to stay, the decision is yours." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. "Stay?" she echoed. "You mean as your employee?" "As more than that," Edward said, his voice steady but not unkind. "You've proven your loyalty to this household, Miss Bennet, and I believe you have much more to offer. If you're willing, I'd like to help you rebuild, not just for Oliver, but for yourself." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the sacrifices, the pain, the fight to protect her brother, and she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with possibility. "Thank you, Mr. Cavendish," she said, her voice trembling. I would be honored to stay. Edward nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Then it settled. That evening, as the sun set over the Cavendish estate, Eleanor stood by the window in her room, watching the golden light spill over the grounds. She thought of Oliver, now safe and free, beginning his own journey toward healing and redemption. She thought of Mrs. Green, whose quiet wisdom had guided her through her darkest moments. And she thought of Edward, whose guarded heart had begun to show cracks of humanity. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew that, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She had found strength in the people around her, in the bonds forged through hardship and trust. And she had found strength in herself, in the quiet resolve that had carried her through every trial. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Eleanor allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Her story wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she was ready to write the next chapter, one step at a time. And in that moment, standing at the edge of a new beginning, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The morning sun bathed the Cavendish estate in a soft golden light, a stark contrast to the storm of events that had consumed the household over the past weeks. Inside the mansion, the air was no longer charged with tension, but carried the quiet weight of reflection. The consequences of recent revelations were beginning to ripple through every corner of the estate, reshaping relationships and laying bare the fragility of trust. Eleanor stood in the small garden near the rear of the house, a basket of freshly cut lavender in her hands. The simple act of tending to the plants brought her a sense of peace, a reprieve from the whirlwind she had endured. Yet, her thoughts remained tangled with the events that had led to this moment. She glanced toward the large windows of the sitting room, where she could just make out Edward's silhouette. He was seated at his desk, speaking in low tones with Mr. Wallace. Eleanor knew they were discussing the estate's future, the necessary measures to rebuild its finances and restore its reputation after Charlotte's betrayal. The knowledge gave her no satisfaction, only a somber understanding of the cost of deception. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Turning, she saw Mrs. Green making her way down the garden path, a warm but weary smile on her face. The older woman held a tray with 2 cups of tea, their steam curling into the crisp morning air. "I thought you could use a break," Mrs. Green said, handing Eleanor a cup. Eleanor accepted it gratefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. She hesitated before asking, "How is he?" Mrs. Green's expression grew thoughtful. "Mr. Cavendish, busy, as always, but I think he's carrying more than he lets on." Charlotte's actions hurt him deeply, more than he'd ever admit. Eleanor nodded, her heart aching for the man who had shown her both suspicion and kindness. "And Charlotte?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Mrs. Green's lips pressed into a thin line. "She's left for London," she said. "Mr. Cavendish insisted on it. I don't know if she'll return, but—" She trailed off, her gaze distant. "But what?" Eleanor prompted gently. Mrs. Green sighed. "I wonder if it's what she truly wanted. Charlotte's always been ambitious, but beneath that, she's a wounded soul. Sometimes, people hurt others because they can't bear to face their own pain." Eleanor stared into her tea, the warmth seeping into her hands. "I wish things had been different," she said quietly. "For her, for Oliver, for everyone." Mrs. Green placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Wishing doesn't change the past, love. But it can guide the future." Inside the mansion, Edward stood in the grand foyer, his gaze fixed on the portrait of his late wife that hung above the fireplace. The weight of his responsibilities bore down on him, heavier now than ever. The betrayal by his own daughter, the near collapse of his family's legacy, and the decisions he had made to correct it all weighed on his mind. He thought of Eleanor, of the quiet resilience she had shown in the face of unimaginable pressure. Her integrity had reminded him of the values he had long neglected in his pursuit of control and order. She had fought not just for herself, but for her brother, sacrificing everything to protect him. It was a kind of loyalty Edward hadn't witnessed in years, and it humbled him. "Mr. Cavendish," Gibbons interrupted softly, stepping into the room. "Miss Bennet is in the garden. She appears reflective." Edward nodded, his jaw tightening. "Thank you, Gibbons." He stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face as he made his way to where Eleanor stood. She was leaning against the wooden fence, the lavender basket at her feet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression calm but guarded. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, straightening. "Is everything all right?" Edward nodded slowly. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, his tone measured, "about what comes next." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I've made arrangements to ensure Oliver has a fresh start," Edward said. "He'll be able to return to his work, and I've set aside a small sum to help him get back on his feet. He deserves that chance." Eleanor's eyes filled with gratitude, though she blinked back her tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what this means to us." Edward hesitated before continuing. "There's more," he said. "I've been thinking about the estate, about its future, and about yours." Eleanor frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "You've shown extraordinary strength, Miss Bennet," Edward said, "strength this household could use. If you're willing, I'd like you to stay, not just as a member of the staff, but as someone who can help rebuild what we've lost." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Edward said simply. "You've earned it." Eleanor looked away, her thoughts racing. The offer was more than she had dared to hope for, but it also came with weighty responsibilities. Could she truly take on such a role? When she turned back to Edward, her resolve had returned. "I'd be honored," she said, "but only if I can repay the trust you've shown me." Edward's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Trust is a two-way street, Miss Bennet, and I believe we're on the right path." As they stood together in the garden, the morning sunlight breaking through the clouds, Eleanor felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The consequences of their choices would linger, shaping their lives in ways they couldn't yet foresee. But in that moment, the foundation for something new, something stronger, had been laid. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that the future held promise. The air inside the Cavendish estate felt different in the days that followed Eleanor's conversation with Edward. Though the mansion still bore the weight of its history, there was a subtle shift, a sense of beginnings where there had once been tension and mistrust. For Eleanor, the quietness allowed room for reflection, though her heart still felt heavy with the echoes of all that had unfolded. In the solitude of her room, Eleanor sat by the window, a small notebook resting on her lap. It had been years since she had written anything for herself, but now words seemed to spill onto the page as if they had been waiting for this moment. She wrote about Oliver, about the bond they had shared since childhood and the sacrifices they had made for each other. She wrote about Edward, whose guarded exterior hid a man capable of fairness, and about Mrs. Green, whose kindness had been a lifeline when Eleanor needed it most. The soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, closing the notebook. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Green, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might need a break," the older woman said with a smile, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "You've been awfully quiet these past few days." Eleanor nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Just thinking," she said, "about everything. Mrs. Green sat across from her, hands wrapped around her own cup. "And what have you decided about all this thinking?" she asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze drifting to the notebook on her lap. "That I'm grateful," she said finally. "Grateful for Oliver's freedom, for the chance Edward gave me, for everything that's happened, even the hard parts." Mrs. Green's expression softened. "Hardship has a way of teaching us what we're made of," she said. "And you, Eleanor Bennet, are made of stronger stuff than most." Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't feel strong." "Strength isn't about feeling it," Mrs. Green replied. "It's about showing up when it matters, and you've done that time and again." Eleanor's chest tightened with emotion, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "I just wish things could have been different for Charlotte," she said quietly. "She hurt so many people, but part of me wonders if she was just trying to prove herself in her own way." Mrs. Green nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy, loving someone who lets their fear turn into ambition, but that doesn't mean you stop loving them, even from afar." Eleanor glanced at her, surprised by the wistfulness in her voice. "You've known her since she was a child," she said. "What was she like?" Mrs. Green smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "Fierce," she said. "Even as a little girl, Charlotte wanted to be seen, to matter. She idolized her mother, but after her passing, it was as if Charlotte couldn't bear to let anyone see her weaknesses, so she buried them, and in their place, she built walls." Eleanor let the words settle over her, a pang of understanding piercing her heart. "I wish she could have found another way," she said softly. Mrs. Green reached across the table, her hand covering Eleanor's. "You're kind, Eleanor. Don't ever lose that." Later that evening, Eleanor wandered the estate grounds, the cool breeze brushing against her face. The lavender she had cut earlier that week now filled a vase in the kitchen, its fragrance lingering in the air. She passed the gardens, the stables, and the small stone bench near the edge of the property where she had often sat to think. As she approached the bench, she saw Edward standing there, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression softening when he saw her. "Miss Bennet," he said, gesturing for her to join him. "I was just taking in the view." Eleanor hesitated before sitting beside him, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. The horizon stretched out before them, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the landscape. "I wanted to thank you," Edward said after a moment, "not just for what you've done for Oliver, but for what you've shown me. Your courage and integrity have reminded me of things I'd long forgotten." Eleanor glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "If anything, I owe you. You gave me a chance when you didn't have to." Edward shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps we both owe each other," he said. "But that's what trust is, isn't it? A mutual exchange." Eleanor considered his words, the simplicity of them resonating deeply. "I suppose it is," she said. They sat in silence for a while longer, the quiet punctuated by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eleanor felt a sense of peace settling over her, a calmness she hadn't known in years. She thought of Oliver, now free to rebuild his life, and of the future that awaited her at the estate. For the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare her. It felt like an open door. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Eleanor turned to Edward, a small but genuine smile on her face. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't say. Edward inclined his head, his own expression softening. "And thank you, Eleanor," he said. Together, they rose and walked back toward the mansion, the glow of the lanterns welcoming them home. The Cavendish estate stood serene under a pale winter sky. its expansive grounds shimmering with frost that caught the soft morning sunlight. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire in the grand sitting room provided a comforting contrast to the chill outside. Eleanor stood near the mantel, carefully arranging a bouquet of fresh flowers she had brought in from the greenhouse. Each movement was deliberate, her touch gentle but confident. It had been several months since the turmoil that had nearly unraveled the household, and though the scars of that time remained, a sense of quiet renewal had taken root. Eleanor felt it in the rhythm of her days, in the light-hearted banter with Mrs. Green in the kitchen, and even in Edward's occasional, though understated, smiles. The estate was alive with new purpose. Edward had thrown himself into repairing the financial and emotional wounds left by Charlotte's actions. He had worked tirelessly with Mr. Wallace to re-establish trust with the trustees and the local community, ensuring the estate's ventures were rebuilt with integrity. Eleanor, too, had found her role evolving. What had started as a position of quiet servitude had grown into something far more significant. Edward relied on her insights, her ability to navigate difficult situations with grace and resolve. She had become, in a way, an unofficial steward of the estate. "Miss Bennet," Edward's voice carried from the doorway, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing there, a folded newspaper in his hand. "Mr. Cavendish," she replied, offering a small smile. "Is everything all right?" He stepped into the room, holding up the paper. "Have you seen this?" he asked, his tone carrying a mix of amusement and pride. Eleanor shook her head as Edward handed her the paper. Her eyes scanned the headline, her breath catching as she read the article about a local charity that had recently been established, a fund to support families in need, with a special focus on those struggling to recover from false accusations or financial ruin. At the center of the initiative was her brother, Oliver. "Oliver mentioned wanting to give back," Eleanor murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't realize—" "He insisted on keeping it quiet at first," Edward said, his expression softening. "He wanted the focus to be on the cause, not on him. But it's making waves. He's already helped several families." Eleanor's chest swelled with pride. Her brother's resilience had always been a source of inspiration, but seeing it manifest in such a tangible way filled her with hope. "He's doing something remarkable," she said, her voice steady. "So are you," Edward said, his tone firm but kind. "Your influence has reached farther than you realize, Eleanor." She looked at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "I only did what anyone would have," she said. Edward shook his head. "No," he said. "You did far more than that. You fought for what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. That kind of strength is rare." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze, finding in it a reflection of the trust and respect they had built. Later that afternoon, Eleanor joined Mrs. Green in the kitchen, where the older woman was preparing a feast for a small gathering Edward had planned. The event was to celebrate the estate's progress, a chance to thank those who had supported its rebuilding. As they worked side by side, Mrs. Green's easy chatter filled the room, punctuated by the occasional clatter of pots and pans. "It's been quite the year, hasn't it?" she said, glancing at Eleanor with a knowing smile. Eleanor nodded, her hands busy chopping vegetables. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she admitted, "everything that happened." "And yet, here you are," Mrs. Green said, her tone affectionate, "standing taller than ever." Eleanor paused, the weight of those words settling over her. She thought of the person she had been when she first arrived, timid, burdened by fear and uncertainty. That person felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone who had learned to trust herself and her ability to face life's challenges. It's because of people like you, Eleanor said softly, meeting Mrs. Green's gaze. I couldn't have done it alone. The older woman waved a hand dismissively, though her smile betrayed her pride. Nonsense, she said. You've always had it in you. You just needed a little nudge. As evening fell, the estate's dining hall filled with warm light and laughter. The small gathering included Edward, Eleanor, Mrs. Green, Mr. Wallace, and a few trusted colleagues who had played key roles in the estate's recovery. The atmosphere was celebratory but intimate, the conversation flowing easily as they shared stories and toasted to the future. Eleanor sat at the table, her heart full as she looked around at the faces of those who had become her unlikely family. She thought of Oliver, who was unable to attend but whose work was already making a difference in the lives of others. She thought of Edward, whose guarded exterior had softened, revealing a man capable of compassion and growth. And she thought of herself, no longer an outsider, but someone with a place and a purpose. As the evening wound down, Edward raised his glass, his voice cutting through the murmurs of conversation. To the future, he said, his gaze sweeping over the table. To the strength we've found in one another, and to the new beginnings we've built together. The toast was met with a chorus of agreement, and as Eleanor raised her glass, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey had been long and fraught with pain, but it had also brought transformation. And as she looked to the days ahead, she knew she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The following week dawned clear and crisp, the chill in the air a gentle reminder of the turning season. Eleanor rose early, her thoughts uncharacteristically scattered. The household had settled into a sense of normalcy, but a faint tension lingered in her chest. She couldn't quite place its source. Perhaps it was the weight of everything they had endured, or perhaps it was the quiet uncertainty that often followed moments of great change. Eager to shake the feeling, she decided to spend the morning sorting through the Cavendish archives. The room, tucked away at the far end of the estate, was rarely visited, its shelves lined with rows of leather-bound books, letters, and trinkets that spoke of the family's long and storied history. Mrs. Green had suggested that some of the items might need to be catalogued, and Eleanor welcomed the distraction. The room smelled faintly of aged paper and cedar, and the soft light from the tall windows lent it an almost reverent air. Eleanor moved methodically, her fingers brushing over the spines of books and the edges of worn envelopes. Each item seemed to tell a story, though most remained hidden in the folds of time. She was carefully dusting an ornate wooden box when something inside rattled. Curious, she opened it, revealing a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The parchment was yellowed with age, the handwriting delicate but deliberate. Eleanor's gaze fell on the topmost letter, her curiosity piqued by the name scrawled on the envelope, Margaret Bennet. Her heart skipped. Bennet was not an uncommon name, but the coincidence was enough to stir her. With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the elegant script. To my dearest Margaret, it has been far too long since we last spoke. My heart aches for the days of our youth, when the world seemed simpler and our friendship unbreakable. I think often of the promise we made to one another, to protect what we held dear, no matter the cost. Life has taken us on different paths, but know that you are never far from my thoughts. Eleanor paused, her breath catching. The letter continued, recounting shared memories and a bond that seemed as deep as it was enduring. It was signed with a name she recognized immediately, Elizabeth Cavendish. The revelation sent a shiver down her spine. Elizabeth Cavendish had been Edward's mother, a woman whose name was spoken with reverence but whose history was rarely discussed. Eleanor hurriedly sorted through the remaining letters, each one a testament to the close relationship between Margaret Bennet and Elizabeth Cavendish. The letters spoke of shared dreams, trials, and a connection that had endured despite the passage of time. Among the letters was a small folded document. Eleanor opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she read. It was a copy of a property deed, naming Margaret Bennet as co-owner of a small parcel of land that had since been absorbed into the Cavendish estate. The deed was dated nearly 70 years ago. Her mind raced. Could Margaret Bennet have been a relative, perhaps even a direct ancestor? The possibility was overwhelming, the implications rippling through her thoughts like a stone dropped into still water. "Miss Bennet?" Edward's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway. He frowned as he took in her wide-eyed expression and the open letters on the table. "What is it?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure of how to explain what she had found. "I was sorting through the archives," she said finally, "and I found these." She gestured to the letters and the deed. Edward stepped forward, his sharp gaze scanning the documents. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, and finally to something akin to reverence. "Margaret Bennet," he murmured. "I've heard the name before. My mother spoke of her once, years ago. She said Margaret was the kind of friend who comes along only once in a lifetime." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions within her. "She might have been my grandmother," she said, "or perhaps even her mother. The timeline fits, and the name, it can't be a coincidence." Edward looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then our families have been connected far longer than either of us realized." The weight of his words settled over them, the discovery casting the events of the past months in a new light. What had once seemed like a series of chance encounters now felt like the culmination of a bond forged generations ago. A bond that had endured in ways neither of them could have imagined. Eleanor's thoughts returned to her own journey, to the struggles and sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. She thought of Oliver, of the resilience they had both shown in the face of adversity, and she thought of Edward, whose guarded exterior had given way to trust and respect. "Perhaps it was fate," she said softly, her gaze meeting Edward's. "Perhaps we were always meant to find our way here." Edward nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps it was simply the strength of the ties that bind us." As they stood together in the quiet stillness of the archives, the weight of the past and the promise of the future seemed to converge. For Eleanor, the discovery was not just a revelation. It was a reminder of the resilience of connection, of the enduring power of trust and loyalty. And in that moment, she felt a deep and abiding peace, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Cavendish estate buzzed with a quiet but palpable energy. Edward Cavendish had arranged a gathering to celebrate the rebirth of the estate, a moment that symbolized not only its recovery, but also the resilience and strength of those who had been a part of its transformation. The house was filled with soft laughter and murmured conversations, the crackling warmth of the fireplaces casting golden light on the faces of the assembled guests. Eleanor stood near the main staircase, her heart fluttering with a mix of anticipation and disbelief. She wore a simple but elegant dress, a gift from Mrs. Green, whose sharp eye for details had ensured Eleanor would feel confident amidst the distinguished company. Yet it wasn't the guests or the grandeur that filled her thoughts, it was Oliver. She had received word that morning that he would be arriving. His work with the charity temporarily paused so he could join her for the celebration. The news had sent a thrill of joy through her, though it was tempered by the lingering question of how he would perceive all that had changed. "Eleanor," Edward's voice drew her attention, and she turned to see him descending the staircase, his expression warm. Our guest of honor has arrived. Eleanor's breath caught as she followed Edward's gaze. Standing in the entryway, framed by the soft glow of the chandelier, was Oliver. He looked different, stronger, more assured, but his familiar smile as their eyes met was enough to bring tears to her own. "Oliver," she whispered, rushing toward him. He caught her in a tight embrace, his laugh soft but filled with emotion. "It's good to see you," he said, his voice steady but brimming with affection. You look like you belong here." Eleanor pulled back, her cheeks flushed. "And you look taller," she teased, her voice trembling with joy. "How have you been?" "Busy," he said, his grin widening. "But it's been worth it. The families we've helped, it feels like everything we've been through has led to this." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. "You've done so much, Oliver, more than I ever imagined. And so have you," he replied, his gaze earnest. "I've heard about what you've done here, how you've helped rebuild this place. Mom would be so proud." His words struck a chord deep within her, and for a moment she felt the presence of their mother, a gentle warmth that steadied her. "Come," Eleanor said, taking his arm. "There's someone you should thank." The room grew quiet as Edward stepped forward to address the guests. Standing near him, Eleanor watched the way he carried himself, his presence commanding yet unpretentious. This was a man who had been shaped by the trials of his life, who had learned to bend rather than break. "Tonight," Edward began, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs, "we celebrate not only the restoration of this estate, but also the people who made it possible. The last year has tested us all, and yet here we stand, stronger, wiser, and united." He glanced at Eleanor, his expression softening. "There are those among us who have shown extraordinary courage, who have reminded us of the importance of loyalty and integrity. Tonight, I wish to honor one such person." Eleanor's breath hitched as Edward gestured for her to join him. The room erupted into applause as she stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "Miss Eleanor Bennet," Edward continued, his voice steady but filled with warmth, "has not only been a source of strength for this household, but also a beacon of resilience. Her sacrifices and unwavering determination have brought us to this moment, and for that we are all deeply grateful." The applause grew louder, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She glanced at Oliver, who beamed at her with unreserved pride, and then at Mrs. Green, whose discreet dab at her own eyes betrayed her emotion. Edward turned to face her fully, his voice lowering so only she could hear. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of everything they had endured together. Eleanor nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to respond. Instead, she turned to the crowd, the warmth of their smiles and the sincerity of their applause filling her with a sense of belonging she had never thought possible. As the evening wound down, Eleanor found herself standing on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The stars were bright, their light scattering across the darkened sky like a promise of hope. Oliver joined her, leaning against the railing with a contented sigh. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. Eleanor nodded, her gaze distant. "It feels like a new beginning." "For both of us," Oliver agreed. "Mum used to say that when one door closes, another opens. I think she'd be proud of the doors we've opened, don't you?" Eleanor smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I do." They stood in silence for a while, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden below. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a deep and abiding peace, a certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As they turned to head back inside, the faint sound of music drifted through the air, and Eleanor felt her heart swell. The trials they had faced had not broken them. They had shaped them, bound them closer together, and given them the strength to embrace the future. And for that, she was profoundly grateful. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.